Welcome to How to Tune a Baitcasting Reel. In this video, we're going to talk about why baitcasters bird's nest and how to set up your baitcaster to fix the problem. I think baitcasters are worth learning. They're an awesome tool. They're more accurate for casting than spinning rods, primarily because you can control the casting distance with your thumb on the spool as you're casting, and they're more comfortable to cast all day long. That said, they can be a little intimidating. People see bird's nests and consider them tough to learn, so they get intimidated and don't want to learn how to do them. With the basic knowledge you'll see in this video, you'll find that you shouldn't be scared and you should definitely pick up a baitcasting rod and not be afraid. Why do baitcasters bird's nest? An important question that the answer will help us do a lot of troubleshooting and make our lives much easier. Fundamentally, baitcasters bird's nest because the spool ends up spinning faster than the bait is pulling line out. Common causes of this are improper settings, light baits that can get caught in the wind or cast too high where they lose momentum and your reel keeps spinning, or you're doing some kind of casting technique that's causing some problems. Before we jump into settings, a quick recap on the key components of a baitcasting reel. First, the button. When you press the button down, it causes the spool to free spool, which allows you to cast and let line come off the spool. Second is the drag. These are considered star drags, and so when you tighten the drag, it makes it harder to pull line off the spool, and if you loosen the drag, it makes it easier to pull line off the spool. That is when the button's engaged. Third, the spool tension knob. It's a little circular knob right below the handle, and what this does, it adds or reduces friction of the spool. So if it's really loose, you can see the spool will wiggle back and forth, and if it's really tight, it makes it more difficult for the spool to turn at all points in the cast. And lastly, brakes. On the opposite side of the reel handle, there'll be brakes, and there's two types, there's centrifugal and magnetic, and I'll jump into those in more detail in a second. The first key setting is setting the spool tension knob. As mentioned, it controls the spool tension throughout the entirety of the cast. You can tell it's loose when the spool rocks back and forth. In practice though, even though it has friction to the whole cast, it's more important for the end of the cast when the bait hits the water and all of a sudden your bait stops moving, but your reel still has momentum. Here I'll show you a quick example of a tight spool tension knob, a kind of medium spool tension knob, and a very loose spool tension knob. As you'll see with the tight cast, I can cast a very short distance because the spool tension doesn't let much line come off. In the medium cast, I can go quite far and very low likelihood of having a bird's nest. And then when I loosen it, I can cast the furthest, but we're getting into the territory of maybe asking for a bird's nest. There's a quick test for ensuring that the spool tension knob is set correctly. Start by tightening the spool tension knob all the way down. Next, click the button so that your spool can free spool. If the spool knob is tight enough, the spool won't spin at all. So slowly loosen the spool tension knob until your bait will start falling. And so ideally your setting will be that when your bait can pull line off your spool, but when it hits the water, it doesn't cause a bunch of extra spin of the spool. Setting this correctly should help you out when you're casting so you don't have to do much thumb control. But as you get more comfortable with it, you can reduce the spool tension knob and use your thumb as a brake right as the bait's hitting the water. This will help you cast a little bit further, but if you don't use your thumb and you have the spool tension knob too loose, it could cause some bird's nests. Brake settings. Modern baitcasters have brakes installed that help with the start of the cast. And this is important because as you load up the rod and make a cast, the second you release the line, your bait starts getting hit with air resistance, wind resistance, and will slow down. But your spool doesn't necessarily see that, so your spool is going to want to keep spinning the same speed as when you started the cast. And so these brakes are important at the beginning of the cast to slow down your spool so you don't have a big burst nest right at the beginning. So there's two types of brakes, centrifugal and magnetic. Centrifugal work by when the spool spins fast enough, it causes the little springs to get depressed and these little centrifugal pieces to cause resistance against the outside of the spool. Generally on these, there won't be a little control knob to set the brakes. You have to actually pull the side off of the baitcasting reel and click these on and off. In my experience though, coming right out of the factory, the settings are actually pretty good, so I haven't messed with them too much, but if you do want to loosen or tighten the brakes, you can pop it open and mess with them. The next type of brakes is magnetic brakes, and these work by having a little magnet slow down the reel. If you look on the side of one of these reels, there's settings to loosen or tighten these magnets. As you can see in my example here, when you tighten it brings the magnets closer to the spool, and when you loosen it takes the magnets further away from the spool. So on these, generally, I find put them to around 60% and then test them. If they work, you can back them off just a little bit until you're starting to get bird's but generally tighter is safer, at least for when you're starting out. So for both these brake settings, like I said, tighten the brakes and then back them off until right before you start having bird's nest problems. And when you're troubleshooting, if the brakes are too loose, you tend to have problems during the start of the cast, as opposed to with the tension knob where you have problems right at the end of the cast. Next, some general tips to help keep you out of trouble. 1. Heavier lures are your friends. Heavier lures are less susceptible to wind resistance and tend to pull line out nice and evenly and are less likely to bird's nest than lighter lures. 2. Settings are bait specific. Make sure to reset them between baits. If you're going from a heavy bait to a light bait, go ahead and look at your tension setting knob and reset it again with the water test I talked about earlier. Next, be careful with light lures, especially in the wind. Remember, the issue with bird's nest is when your bait changes speed and your reel is still spinning at a speed. So if you cast a light lure into the wind and the wind catches it, it can cause a bird's nest in a split second. Next, especially when you're first learning how to use a bait caster, I recommend sacrificing casting distance and ease into looser settings. What I mean by that is tend to have your brakes a little tighter and your tension knob a little tighter as you get more comfortable with it. You're much less likely to bird's nest if they're tight. As you get comfortable, start loosening them and make sure to use your brakes to slow down the reel when you need to during the cast. The next tip has to do with casting technique. Don't wing it as hard as you can or sky blast the lure. These two options tend to cause bird's nest. When you wing it, a lot of times you're adding so much momentum so fast to the reel that you overpower the brakes, and so you cause a bird's nest. And similar with sky blasting, if you launch your lure up into the sky, eventually gravity is going to take over and the bait's going to start coming down. When the bait slows down, your reel doesn't really realize that and it wants to go the same speed as when you started casting it. And then finally, for troubleshooting, if you're having problems at the beginning of the cast, you should look at your brakes, and if you're having problems at the end of the cast, you should look at your tension knob settings. In conclusion, correct settings will make your life much easier. Make sure to set the tension knob for every bait you use. When starting out, sacrifice casting distance with tighter settings for practice. Loosen these settings as you get more comfortable. Practice using your thumb to slow down your spool. If you like this video, check out the links in the description for some of my favorite gear recommendations. My name is Andrew with Duran Adventures, and thanks for watching.